A frame captured on the 4th of July near Palm Beach, freshly pried from the archives of the United Cajun Navy. For months, the narrative surrounding the water, the boats, and the final hours of Nolan Wells has been packaged and handed to the public as a settled matter of tragic coincidence. We were handed a neat timeline detailing who went where, who left when, and how Nolan supposedly vanished into the quiet expanse of the afternoon, until this surfaced. Let us strip away the noise and look at the geometry of this single, damning visual piece where Nolan or someone locked in an aggressive spatial standoff, one featuring a distinctly darker complexion, while the other is paler, leaning inward, shoulders squared, posture rigid, represents the exact kinetic posture of an escalation before a shove turns into a punch, or a verbal jab turns into a physical brawl. Look immediately to the left of the confrontation at the young woman walking past the frame, freezing her expression as her head snaps toward Nolan's direction, her mouth slightly parted, and her eyes wide with a very distinct primal realization that something is about to go down. Pan slightly wider across the deck and the surrounding water to look at the person standing in a red swimsuit and the other witnesses standing shoulder to shoulder, completely paralyzed in the water, tracking the exact vector of this argument, because nobody is laughing, nobody is holding up a drink to toast the holiday, and they are entirely braced, looking completely shook, waiting for a bomb involving Nolan to detonate in slow motion. Right at the periphery of this simmering powder keg stands Warren on the Palm Beach boat, looking like he has survived the absolute hardest paper route imaginable, clutching something in his hand as we zoom right in on his grip to question whether that is a 24-ounce Dr. Pepper or a Pepsi to cope with whatever Nolan was dealing with. But whatever carbonated crutch Warren uses to ground himself, Warren looks entirely detached from the chaos, yet entirely anchored to the exact geographic coordinates of the mess, because he did not leave the Palm Beach boat since the drama involving Nolan was being delivered straight to his doorstep. This specific frame matters because according to every single official account, every deposition whisper, and every structured alibi offered up in the immediate aftermath regarding Nolan, this confrontation, and this exact moment of palpable, aggressive hostility simply should not exist at the timestamp it was captured. To deconstruct the ecosystem of this specific watercraft gathering, we must recognize that the United Cajun Navy report did not just drop a pretty picture and walk away, but rather cracked open a hornet's nest of contradictory eyewitness testimonies that reveal this was never just a casual gathering of kids having fun in the sun, but rather a pressurized cabin floating on an open lake where Nolan found himself surrounded. Let us look at the boat arrangement itself, because from a wider overhead angle, the visual data clearly outlines a cluster of vessels including Boat 1, Boat X, Boat 2, and Boat 3, alongside the Palm Beach where Warren anchors his stationary presence, and the Triton, where Nolan and Wyatt spent chunks of the day. For the longest time, the narrative insisted that Nolan and Warren were tethered to the same hip, moving together through the afternoon, but these wider angle shots tell a completely fractured story where Warren is anchored to the Palm Beach, while Nolan, towering over most of the crowd at well over 6 feet tall, is allegedly spotted elsewhere, forcing us to ask who that towering frame belongs to, and whether Nolan was small enough, brave enough, or angry enough to stand toe-to-toe and nose-to-nose with someone at eye level. Eyewitness statements collected from the scene introduce a man named Matthew Lamp, who came forward with a very specific observation, because one of his passengers, sitting mere feet away from the unfolding chaos involving Nolan, was explicitly certain that they were part of a group caught up in a near fight right around 5 o'clock in the evening. Noting that a Bertram with a blue top, which he had previously posted about, scrambled away from the area shortly after that confrontation concluded, peeling off at a high rate of speed as if desperate to put distance between themselves and whatever Nolan had just boiled over. Immediately, the defensive machinery kicked into gear as another individual connected to the circle jumped into the digital discourse to fire back with absolute outrage, demanding how anyone could dare spread such a complete lie that never happened concerning Nolan, which begs whether this was a cover-up, a defensive reflex, or simply people scrambling to rewrite a narrative about Nolan that was already slipping through their fingers. When people in the forums throw around names like Bart, we remember that Bart's public stance has been consistent and defensive as he maintains adamantly that he was not fighting Nolan on the island, that it was not him in that confrontation, that he did not do anything wrong, and that he did not even know Katie or Nolan at the exact time this still frame was pulled from the video file, leaving us with a very narrow and very dangerous short list of individuals who occupied that water with Nolan if it was neither Bart nor Warren. We cannot talk about the visual evidence of this day without addressing the peripheral figures who silently witness history unfold, such as the young woman with striking blonde hair, visible in the background of the water shots where Nolan spent his final hours. When these photos first surfaced, the immediate knee-jerk reaction across investigative circles was to ask if that was Katie, since Katie's movements, timeline, and association with Nolan have been central to every single theory built around this case. But looking closer at the physical markers reveals that while Katie was wearing a distinct bluish-teal swimsuit on that day, the blonde woman walking through the background of this specific confrontation wears a swimsuit color that does not cleanly match that teal hue when Nolan was reportedly nearby. Observers have pointed out that if you are a young white woman spending a holiday weekend in that specific coastal region with Nolan, blonde seems to be the universal uniform and the universal reason for the seasonal migration, meaning whether her hair color is natural or bottled is completely irrelevant compared to the physics of her proximity, because this blonde woman walks past the exact vector of the fight involving Nolan, glances over, and mirrors the exact same shock as the girl in the red swimsuit, as the community reacts in real time to a localized flashpoint of violence centering on Nolan. If that is not Katie, we must ask who she is, and more importantly, why she has not been prominently featured in the official breakdown of who was standing where when the temperature of the afternoon crossed from playful to aggressive around Nolan. Because in an investigation built entirely on the shaky pillars of memory, every unknown face near Nolan is a potential vault of hidden information, and every bystander who does not remember seeing a fight involving Nolan is an active participant in the erosion of the truth. Stripping away the ambiguity brings us to the raw demographic reality of that specific frame, where the mathematical impossibility of the official story completely collapses in on itself concerning Nolan. Because according to eyewitness counts and crowd layouts, there were only 2 black individuals in the water during this specific phase of the afternoon gathering, namely Tristan and Nolan, meaning that out of everyone splashing around, congregating, drinking, and maneuvering boats near that island, the racial and physical layout of the group boils down to those 2 specific young men, leading us to play out 2 scenarios where neither allows anyone in the official inner circle to sleep peacefully at night regarding Nolan. In the first scenario, if the person engaged in this fierce, close-quarters face-off is Tristan, we face a catastrophic collapse of the timeline because Tristan's own recorded statements given during interactions with authorities, like Officer Geno, insisted that he left the island early, claiming his uncle physically put him in a boat and rushed him away from the location very quickly, well before the rest of the core group of boys made their final exit away from Nolan, and going out of his way to specify the sequence of his departure by claiming he said goodbye to Nolan after a minor skirmish broke out, while dropping a final, slightly sharp or slick remark regarding Katie before his uncle pulled him away from Nolan. However, looking at the timestamp logic here reveals that if Tristan was still locked in this near fight at 5 o'clock in the evening, and if he did not leave until after that skirmish concluded, then his entire narrative of an early exit away from Nolan is utterly false and completely destroys the alibis of everyone else. Because if he was still on the island at 5 o'clock jawing with someone near Nolan, then the timeline placing everyone's final sightings of Nolan around 3 o'clock is a fabricated illusion, and someone is lying about when the island emptied out around Nolan. In the second scenario, if that tall frame standing toe-to-toe with an adversary is Nolan Wells himself, the implications are infinitely darker, because Nolan stood at an imposing height between 6'1" and 6'3", meaning Nolan was not someone easily towered over, and whoever is standing in Nolan's face in this photograph is either remarkably tall themselves or standing on a submerged ledge, looking straight up into Nolan's eyes with unmistakable aggression. If this is Nolan at 5 o'clock, we must remember what was discovered later during the preliminary autopsy reports, where Nolan's body recovered from the water bore physical bruises, blunt force trauma markers, and signs of a physical struggle that the official narrative tried to brush off as post-mortem tumbling or minor water damage on Nolan, meaning that if Nolan was actively engaged in a heated, chest-to-chest physical confrontation at 5 o'clock, then the narrative that Nolan peacefully drifted away or vanished into thin air without conflict hours earlier is exposed as a glaring, deliberate falsehood that proves the last hours of Nolan's life were loud and hostile, while people currently walk around with complete knowledge of who threw the first punch at Nolan. Bringing in the final piece of digital forensic data that locks this entire mystery into a stranglehold, we look at the 431 call regarding Nolan, because for months the group of boys at the center of this investigation have leaned heavily on a specific digital paper trail to save themselves by pointing to their recorded 431 call to authorities or emergency services, backed up by precise GPS coordinates like a holy shield, to say that their coordinates prove they were there, doing this, handling their business, and moving away from Nolan's last known location. It is a clean alibi on paper, but paper burns when exposed to photographic reality when we do the math that nobody in the official reports wants to calculate out loud about Nolan. Because if the GPS coordinates and the 431 call place these individuals, or at least parts of this traveling party, at a specific location, or in the process of towing and leaving, how on earth is there crystal clear photographic evidence of an active, highly charged, near-violent confrontation happening right around that exact same window, or extending past it near Nolan? If Tristan was still on the island getting into skirmishes that delayed his departure well past the afternoon hours when Nolan was active, then the boys' coordinated timeline of when they left, when they last saw Nolan, and when their boats were moving, is completely out of sync, proving you cannot occupy two different physical spaces simultaneously, because either the GPS timestamps and the 431 call are being weaponized to obscure what was actually happening on the water during that critical hour involving Nolan, or the eyewitnesses placing this fight at 5 o'clock are catastrophically mistaken, and this photo of Nolan or his peers was taken much earlier than anyone is admitting, or everyone is lying to protect a sequence of events that turns a tragic accident involving Nolan into something infinitely more sinister. Think about the logistical friction here, because if you are trying to cover up a confrontation that went too far with Nolan, the first thing you manipulate is time, by stretching 3 o'clock into 5 o'clock, compressing travel windows, and relying on the natural chaos of a 4th of July holiday weekend, with people drinking, boats moving, music playing, and sun glare blinding casual observers to blur the edges of your timeline regarding Nolan. Standing at the edge of this digital dock and staring across choppy water at a series of unyielding contradictions concerning Nolan, we review the ledger of what we know for an absolute fact versus what the official story tries to feed us about Nolan. Noting as a fact that the United Cajun Navy released new photographic evidence capturing a high-tension, face-to-face confrontation on the water near Palm Beach during the 4th of July gathering involving Nolan or his circle, and noting as another fact that eyewitness testimony anchors this specific confrontation right around the 5 o'clock mark, complete with a speedy getaway by a blue-topped Bertram boat fleeing the scene, which directly contradicts the official narrative and witness timelines, placing the final sightings of Nolan Wells at least 2 hours earlier, around 3 o'clock, supported by a heavily cited 431 call and GPS data. Furthermore, the demographic layout of the water restricts the participants of this standoff to a very small pool, forcing either Tristan or Nolan into the center of a physical altercation that both official statements and personal alibis tried to sweep under the rug, while the autopsy echo reveals that Nolan's body later returned physical evidence of bruising that does not match a peaceful disappearance, but matches the exact kinetic violence visible in the posture of the two men in this newly surfaced frame featuring Nolan. Two distinct truths cannot occupy the same reality regarding Nolan, because if that is Tristan in the frame, he lied about when he left and who he spoke to while Nolan was there, whereas if that is Nolan in the frame, Nolan was fighting for his space and potentially his life just an hour before the official narrative claims Nolan simply faded away into the afternoon mist. The witnesses are not merely mistaken, because while human memory is fallible, human memory does not accidentally manufacture a multi-boat logistical cover story, misplace a 5-hour afternoon street-style brawl on the water involving Nolan, and misalign GPS check-ins by hours at a time. Since this level of discrepancy requires coordination, people keeping their stories straight about Nolan, and silence where there should be screaming questions, as we stare down the barrel of these unbudgeted hours and unaccounted for minutes regarding Nolan, the core mystery of the case sharpens into something painfully clear, because the answers concerning Nolan are not hidden in the deep water where Nolan was eventually found, but are sitting right here frozen in digital pixels on the surface of a bright 4th of July afternoon, where people thought nobody was paying close enough attention to the background details around Nolan. Look at the blonde girl's face one last time, Look at Warren holding his drink and watching the world burn in slow motion from the deck of the Palm Beach boat where Nolan was anchored in conversation. And look at the two figures locked inches apart, defying every single timestamp the defense has tried to establish for Nolan. Someone in this photo knows exactly who threw the punch at Nolan. Someone knows why the timeline for Nolan was scrubbed, and someone knows why the official story relies so heavily on a version of events regarding Nolan that falls apart the second you zoom in on the picture. Because the timeline concerning Nolan is broken, the alibis are bleeding out, and the truth about Nolan is waiting right in the frame. Drop into the comments right now and tell me what you see when you look at those two faces locked in the water to decide whether this is the missing piece of the puzzle for Nolan or just another layer of deception in a case built on quicksand. Because we are going live to break down every single pixel, every metadata tag, and every exposed lie regarding Nolan very soon. And until then, do not look away from the screen because the truth about Nolan is right there in plain sight.